Morning, everybody. Welcome to the March 15th Earth Spirit session. Where am I today? Oh, there's a big mountain over there, a lake at the base of that mountain. Oh, and snow on the mountain. An iconic mountain in Japan, Mount Fuji. So today we actually are going to go deep into Yamanashi Prefecture. And we're actually staying probably, oh, I don't know, 15 miles away from Mount Fuji. So it's a magnificent sight. And yesterday we just got here. So that's where we are today. Let's talk about Earth Spirit. Last week we talked a little bit about ascending aura. And I said we were going to pick up on air drying versus withering. And indeed, that's what we're going to do. That's where we're going to start. So why do you air dry leaves and what does it really mean? It means you take the picked leaves, you spread them single layer by and large outside under the sun, unless it's raining, in which case you wait until you get a day where it's not raining and it's not wet or foggy or dewy or snowy. You wait till you get one of those days, and they have lots of those days in Yunnan. And this tea, by the way, where are you waiting? That's a fair question. You're waiting in the Jingmai Mountains. And the Jingmai Mountains are part of the Bulong Mountains, and they run very close. In fact, they do run to the border of Burma. And so in Jingmai, you're about, as the crow flies, 25, 30 miles away from the border of Burma. So you're close. And you're not all that far away from what in Vietnamese is called the Mekong River, in Chinese, Langtan River. It's really a rich area, rich history, rich vegetation, both the flora and the fauna. There are actually elephants, wild elephants in this area, not actually in the Jingmai Mountains, but close by, not very far away. And all sorts of other animals in this area. And it's more humid than not most of the year. And so the vegetation is quite lush. The diet here is more spicy than some of the other places, and you have indigenous peoples all living together. So historically, air drying and then withering were the first two steps after picking the tea. Then you had innovators and creative people. You probably had some bean counters there too, because what happens next? They're starting to suggest, you know what? Why are we air drying and withering? Both of those processes. Let's shorten the process. Let's just wither. 3 inches, do it on a machine. We don't have to have the sun. Be so much easier, cheaper, because we don't have to have all that space to be spraying everything outside. So this created a problem within the puer industry, because all of a sudden, many of the traditionally very good puers were flat, not so good. And as scientists, agricultural scientists, did more and more analysis, they said, oh my God, what's wrong with you guys? That famous poet in the Tang Dynasty, Liu Yu, said, it's good to have some innovation, but overall, don't throw out all the great things that you've developed so far. And that's what combining air drying and withering did. And you still, to this day, are trying to overcome the effects of that. So that became something of a thing starting in the 1990s. And it became a real thing in the early 2000s because you had investors come in. Hey, can't you do this a different way? Can't you shorten the process? Can't you make it less expensive? And the answer, of course, is yes. We can make boba tea if that's what you want. Oh, wait a minute. They probably didn't quite say it that way. But you catch where I'm going with this. Shortcuts don't equal better. And in this case, it really didn't equal better. Why is it? Let's go into the science of this. When you air dry, you reduce the moisture in the leaf by about 30%. So what does the leaf look like? It's still green, it's flexible, it still has energy. There's actually photosynthesis still taking place in the leaf, although much more slowly since it's removed from the mother plant. The chemical changes in the leaf haven't really started. What has occurred with the air dry is stabilization. Ah, all right. But isn't that the same thing? I mean, you throw a few leaves on the ground, you throw a few leaves on a machine. What's the difference? Glad you asked that question. First off, you're piling it about an inch or so. As soon as you pile leaves, what does that imply? That implies sweating, heat. You get leaves together like that, and whether you're running air, and by the way, that is why you're running air through there, because you don't want them to get so hot. But they are giving off heat because chemical reactions are occurring within the leaves. Polysaccharides become monosaccharides. I knew I could get another long word in this week. I have a few more, but I better stop there. And you have other compounds become simplified amino acids. So there's chemical change. That's why you couldn't skip that step. You needed to get the water evenly distributed, and by water, I mean the moisture, evenly distributed in the leaf, and then do the chemical process and allowing heat to stimulate that chemical process. What does the leaf look like, by the way, at the end? It's dark green, and it's not really as pliable as the one with all the moisture. Yes.
Any studies out there on the difference in the chemical outcome of these leaves for the outdoor drying versus the controlled environment that the bean counters were experimenting with?
It's a great question. So the questioner asked, are you just making all this stuff up, or are there scientific articles which can support this astounding fact that you're revealing to us? And the answer is there are studies, and next session, when we do Neutron Star, I'll reference some very specific studies, because one that I looked at talked about withering being good for green tea and oolong tea. And by the way, I did not agree with their total conclusion. But you know what? I'm an understudy, so words are cheap. I can just say that, and there's no consequence. I did agree with it in terms of the oolong, and we'll talk about that next week. In fact, we'll lead off with this discussion about what sort of end result from a chemical compound should we be looking to experience? And as users, what's the benefit to us? So we'll start off next week when we do Neutron Star with that question. In the meantime, Jingmai, these leaves are from trees that are anywhere from 800 to 1300 years old. So they're right there on the border of very old early ancient. And in addition, these trees, when you look at them, the placement of them makes you feel like somehow a long time ago they were planted. One more historical fact, and then I'll stop talking. So this area, the Bulong Mountains, they've done a lot of research in some of these villages, and these are almost all indigenous villages. They found artifacts from 1066 BC, which seemed to indicate that people planted tea plants at that time and actually drank tea at that time. And it was a minority group called the Baipu, which lived in this area. So the current Bulong people, Hani people, Lahu people, bunch of peoples who all can claim some kinship with the original set of people. They take tea variously as a totem, as a god, as part of their life force, and they trace it all the way back to this origin. So it's really interesting when you go there. If you have the chance to walk deep in the mountains, there are all of these carvings, and the carvings don't look Han at all. And so you obviously have the influence of an old culture in this area. And apparently they found stuff to prove, at least to themselves, that they were drinking tea early on. All right. So I think I've given you enough to start out with. This is a fully fermented. I'm going to have Biju go ahead and brew it. Take good notes, because remember, when we come back and have our next session together, April 12th, if you have questions, we'll go through them at that time. So it is my great pleasure to bring Biju, the tea master.
Hey, good morning, everyone. Yeah, 早上好. We do fermented tea, it's from Yunnan. Okay, so fermented tea, so you can have this the same usual. Okay, 2 cups. And then, so here I have onion, yeah.
This one?
3 minutes, same 20 seconds or so to rinse. This one makes me cry when I rinse, because this tea is so good. So I'm not supposed to be giving this stuff away. Well, I just did. And secretly, when nobody's watching, I don't rinse. But since you're watching, I rinse every single time. I rinse real good. And this is a loose leaf fermented tea. So they decided not to cake this thing. And this thing is just out of this world interesting.
That must really change the nature of the aging process when it's loosely cake, which I think it touched on.
Great observation. It does in fact change the nature of the aging process. It changes 2 things. So when you're creating this, you have to take into account that, hey, it's all going to be exposed to the air right away. Therefore, whatever is left over to ferment is going to happen fast. Any sidebar oxidation will happen fast. So yes, and that's probably the other reason that I like this tea so much, because they certainly seem to have this all together in terms of thinking about how is this going to age? Because this stuff is, I want to say, at least 10 years old. I think it's older. Yeah, I think it's more like 15 or 16 years old. And yet it's still got the vigor of a more youthful one, but also the balance and maturity of an older one. And part of that has to do with yeah, these guys, again, they're indigenous people, so they're not doing it the same way that the factory is doing it. In 2 weeks' time, you're gonna have Celestial Offering, which is another loose leaf. And I ask you to really, really be careful in taking notes about this because I want you specifically to compare it to that one. Because that one is very standard, it's very Han Chinese, all the rules were followed in a certain way. This one is very indigenous peoples. They use their own methodology, which is not the Han way in a big factory, and you can taste it. This doesn't make one better than the other, because remember, I love all my children, it's without doubt. It does make me think about this one a lot when my eyes are wandering over the board and I'm thinking, yeah, I gotta have a fermented tea. And they quite frequently stop here. There's another one or two that they stop at as well, but this is one of them. And again, it's partly because, and I'm not going to give it away, there is a certain sense that this tea brings to you as you're drinking it, which is different from, I find it different from the other fermented teas. I really like this one. I like them all, though. I really like them. All right. Let's see how we're doing. Oh, we're almost out of time for this one.
Are there regions in China where fermented is drunk more frequently it's expected? And is that, I presumably I would imagine like where it's made, you have more of it drunk, but what's the real story?
This is a great question. Where is most of this drunk? In China. And you would say Yunnan, where it's from, and Canton province. Those two places. Why? Yunnan, it's easy because that's where it's made. And so people are drinking their own creation. And this is in a village. So villagers are consuming this. People who really like a higher level of this type of tea. And look at that color. Isn't that beautiful? Absolutely beautiful. So people who want a higher quality come from all over China to this village to procure this. So that's part of who drinks it. In general, fermented teas tend to be drunk a lot in Canton and Hong Kong because they're food choices. They eat a lot of fatty foods, and this is great at helping digest. Just go to a dim sum restaurant. Every reputable dim sum restaurant in Northern California, if you ask them, it may not be on the menu, but you ask them, you have pu'er? And they'll answer yes. Because that's what the locals from Canton. Great. All right. So go through the normal quality arena. This is a fun tea to go through that with. And we're going to stop here for this one today. And then next week, we will do Neutron Star. And we'll continue talking about, what am I supposed to talk about again? I'm talking about...
We processing some more? Oh, no, we're talking about the difference between like processing, actually, it is processing, the impact of the studies that you've read.
Oh, that's right. Okay. Yes. The impact, thank you very much. The impact of studies on the various forms of processing, especially the difference between air drying and withering. And if you don't do one, what happens to the tea leaves? We'll lead off with that next week. In the meantime, you all have a wonderful week. Stay healthy and we'll see you next week. Neutron Star. Bye-bye.